The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation suddenly stopped as the elderly black woman sat quietly in the diner, sipping her coffee. No one noticed the cop until his hand flew across her face, the slap echoing through the room. The room froze. She didn't flinch, didn't scream, she just stared. But what he didn't know, the woman wasn't just any diner regular. Her son, the FBI director. How far will the system go to hide its darkest secrets, and how will it all unravel when the truth comes to light? Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Jamal was just like any other teenager trying to make it through high school. His days were filled with the typical rhythm of life: school, friends, soccer practice, and the occasional argument with his little sister, Zoe. He was proud of his mom, who had worked tirelessly as a nurse to provide for him and his siblings. He didn't need much else to be content except the peace of being left alone to grow up. He didn't know it yet, but today, things would change. As he strolled through the crowded halls of his high school, his thoughts were lost in the music pumping through his headphones. His best friend, Devin, waved at him from across the courtyard. A simple wave, a familiar gesture, one of those moments where everything felt normal, but deep down, Jamal knew something wasn't quite right. It wasn't a feeling he could pinpoint, but there were whispers. Not the kind you could hear clearly, but just enough to make you wonder what was being said behind your back. A few weeks earlier, his soccer coach, Coach Harris, had acted a little too awkward when talking to him. Then there were the subtle remarks in class that never seemed to make sense, comments about how people like you are naturally good at sports, or how it must be hard to live in that neighborhood. Jamal's gut always told him something was off, but he brushed it aside, hoping it was just high school drama. He didn't want to overthink it. At home, his mom had a way of protecting him. She'd always said, "You keep your head up, stay focused, and don't let anyone tell you who you are." She knew what it was like to feel like the world was waiting for you to slip up. Jamal respected that advice, even if sometimes it was hard to follow. Today, the diner was where things were going to unravel. The warm aroma of pancakes and coffee filled the air as Jamal sat at a booth, waiting for his mom to arrive after her shift. His mom worked long hours, but she always made time for him. He often came here to wait for her to finish work, knowing she'd greet him with a tired smile and a hug that made the weight of the world seem just a little lighter. He scrolled through his phone. He didn't notice the two men who had walked in behind him, one of them a cop, the other a regular. The tension in the air was almost invisible, like a storm cloud forming just out of view. Jamal didn't sense it yet, but as the cop's heavy boots hit the floor, it was already too late. The moment that would change everything for Jamal and for his family was closer than he realized. For now, all he knew was that life was simple, predictable. But that was about to shatter in ways no one could prepare for. Rising action. Jamal's fingers tapped anxiously against the table as he watched the clock. His mom's shift was supposed to end in 20 minutes. She'd been working extra shifts lately, trying to make up for the hospital's budget cuts. Jamal hated seeing her so tired, especially when all he could do was wait. She always made it seem like it was no big deal, but he knew better. His mom had the kind of strength most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. But tonight, as he sat alone in the diner, he felt something different in the air, something he couldn't ignore. It was the subtle way the waitress looked at him when she passed by. Not the usual friendly smile, but a side glance, the kind that made his skin prickle uncomfortably. He shrugged it off, telling himself he was just being paranoid. People were always looking at him differently, but that didn't mean they had anything against him. He'd been through enough to know that sometimes people just didn't know how to act around someone who didn't look like them. He thought about Zoe's latest complaint about school, how she'd heard a classmate call her ghetto under their breath, how no one had said anything. His mom had made them promise never to let that stuff get to them. But Jamal knew the truth sometimes it did. The door to the diner opened with a loud jingle, and the sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Jamal glanced up and saw a man walk in, his uniform giving him an immediate presence. A police officer. The man's uniform was crisp, his badge shining under the harsh diner lights. Jamal didn't recognize him, but he did know the type. He was one of those cops who walked through life with a little too much pride, the kind who seemed to think the badge gave them permission to look down on everyone else. Jamal looked away, instinctively. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't like he had anything against cops, just that he'd seen enough of them to know that not all were the good guys. It wasn't fair to generalize, but Jamal couldn't help feeling uneasy. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood had taught him a lot about survival. He'd learned that you always had to keep your guard up, especially in places that didn't seem to want you there. The cop's voice boomed as he placed his order, his words loud enough to cut through the soft hum of conversation. Jamal didn't catch all of it, but what he did hear made him tense. The cop was complaining about the slow service. "Come on, how long does it take to pour a cup of coffee?" The officer grumbled, his tone condescending. Jamal frowned, the frustration rising in his chest. He hated when people treated others like they were invisible. He glanced at the waitress, who was clearly struggling to keep it together. She was only a few years older than him, and the way the cop was talking to her made Jamal's blood boil. He didn't know why, but something about the situation didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way the cop spoke to her, like she was beneath him. Maybe it was the casual racism in his words, something Jamal had seen 1,000 times but never spoken out loud about. Either way, it was clear that this wasn't just a simple interaction. Jamal's grip tightened on his coffee cup. He wasn't sure what made him do it, but he stood up, walking toward the counter. He had to say something, even if it was just to let the cop know that someone was watching. "You don't need to talk to her like that," Jamal said, his voice low but firm. The cop turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked Jamal up and down. The way the man's eyes lingered on him made Jamal's stomach tighten. This wasn't going to be a casual confrontation. He could feel it. "What did you say, kid?" The officer's voice was laced with a dangerous calmness. Jamal swallowed hard. He hadn't planned on getting into a fight, he was just trying to stand up for the waitress. But now, as the officer's gaze sharpened, Jamal realized he might have made a huge mistake. The diner, once buzzing with low conversations and clinking dishes, had suddenly gone silent. "Everyone was watching," I said. "You don't need to talk to her like that," Jamal repeated, his voice a little louder now, a little more confident. The cop stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "You better watch your mouth, boy," the cop sneered. His tone wasn't just angry, it was threatening. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Jamal's heart was racing, and he tried to steady his breath, but the adrenaline was already coursing through him. The waitress was behind the counter, her hands shaking as she watched. Jamal could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She was just trying to do her job, and here he was, dragging her into something bigger than either of them. But there was no going back now. "I'm not gonna stand here and let you disrespect her," Jamal said, his voice trembling slightly but louder than before. The officer took a step toward him, his face now inches from Jamal's. The air between them crackled with tension. Jamal's pulse hammered in his ears. For a moment, he thought the officer might hit him, might shove him against the counter, or worse. But the cop just stared, sizing him up, his expression cold. "Get out of my face before I arrest you for disorderly conduct," the officer spat, his voice low and threatening. Jamal stood his ground, refusing to back down. His mind raced. He knew he had to be careful, knew he couldn't afford to escalate things further. But his legs were shaking now, his body caught between fight and flight. The cop's fingers twitched, and Jamal braced himself, expecting the worst. But instead, the officer's gaze flicked to the door as a car honked outside. He turned quickly, muttering something under his breath, and walked away without another word. Jamal stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily. The weight of the tension in the air slowly started to fade, but it was replaced by something heavier. The unease that had settled in his stomach. The sudden realization that this was just the beginning, and that his actions were bound to have consequences. The waitress walked over, her hands still trembling as she wiped down the counter. "Thank you," she whispered. Jamal nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't about being thanked. It was about what had just happened and what would happen next. The door to the diner swung open again, and this time, it wasn't just any cop walking in. It was the same officer, but now he was accompanied by two other men, both wearing dark suits and sunglasses. They walked with an air of authority, heads held high, their steps slow and deliberate. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. Not now, not here. The officer's glare locked onto him. He made his way toward the booth, his eyes cold and filled with unspoken anger. This was more than just a personal dispute. Now it was a showdown. "Kid, I told you to leave," the officer sneered, his voice rising. "You've crossed a line. I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace." Jamal's hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, the words "under arrest" echoing in his head like a drum. His mouth went dry, but he didn't back down. Not this time. He wasn't just standing up for the waitress anymore. This was bigger than that. This was about what happened when people in power use their position to intimidate, to silence, and to hurt. Jamal shot a glance around the diner. Eyes were glued to him now. People were watching. He could feel their judgment, their fear, their uncertainty. But there was something else in the air, to something shifting. His legs shook from adrenaline, but his resolve was unwavering. He wasn't going to let them push him around. "Is that what you're going to do?" Jamal said, his voice steady but louder now. "Arrest me for defending someone from a racist cop." The officer paused, taken aback by the boldness in Jamal's voice, but he didn't hesitate. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," the cop spat. "I'll have you in jail before your mom even knows what happened." Jamal's eyes flicked to the door again, his heart skipping. He didn't know why, but a new surge of confidence filled him. It was like the walls of the diner were closing in, but instead of suffocating him, they were pushing him forward. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone. He pressed record. "You sure about that?" Jamal asked, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You really want to keep making threats? You should know that I've got connections." The officer paused, looking over his shoulder at his colleagues, his expression flickering. For a split second, Jamal saw doubt cross his face. The man didn't know who he was, but Jamal did. He had a plan. He'd had enough of the secrecy, the hidden power structures that allowed people like this officer to abuse their authority. He wasn't going to back down. "Not now. You don't know who I am," Jamal continued, the words coming faster now, almost like a wave breaking through the dam. "I'm not some kid you can throw around. My mom, she's got friends in high places. You think I don't know how to get this out to the media? You think I don't know how much weight my family carries?" The officer's face turned red. The other men in suits exchanged quick, uneasy glances. It was a moment of hesitation, a crack in their armor. They had expected Jamal to be intimidated, to be scared. But instead, Jamal saw something in their eyes: fear. Fear of what could happen if this moment went public. The officer took a step toward Jamal, his face now inches from Jamal's. The air between them crackled with tension. Jamal's pulse hammered in his ears. For a moment, he thought the officer might hit him, might shove him against the counter, or worse. But the cop just stared, sizing him up, his expression cold. "Get out of my face before I arrest you for disorderly conduct," the officer spat, his voice low and threatening. Jamal stood his ground, refusing to back down. His mind raced. He knew he had to be careful, knew he couldn't afford to escalate things further. But his legs were shaking now, his body caught between fight and flight. The cop's fingers twitched, and Jamal braced himself, expecting the worst. But instead, the officer's gaze flicked to the door as a car honked outside. He turned quickly, muttering something under his breath, and walked away without another word. Jamal stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily. The weight of the tension in the air slowly started to fade, but it was replaced by something heavier. The unease that had settled in his stomach. The sudden realization that this was just the beginning. and that his actions were bound to have consequences. The waitress walked over, her hands still trembling as she wiped down the counter. "Thank you," she whispered. Jamal nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't about being thanked. It was about what had just happened and what would happen next. As he sat back down, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. He didn't know how or when, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not yet. The diner was quieter now, the hum of normalcy returning, but Jamal felt something had shifted inside him. The last few moments, the confrontation, the unexpected arrival of the FBI director, it all felt surreal. As the sound of the front door closing behind the officer echoed in his mind, Jamal couldn't help but replay the look in the officer's eyes, the subtle crack in his confidence when he realized who was standing behind him. Jamal's fingers hovered over his phone for a moment, still recording. His chest was tight, but he could feel the power of the moment, the sense of justice, and something more. He was used to the stories. The ones his mom would tell him in hushed tones, the ones his friends whispered in hallways and on street corners. How the system would turn a blind eye to people who weren't white, how even when you spoke up, it often didn't matter. But today was different. He took a deep breath, his pulse slowly calming as the realization began to sink in. This time, something had been done. And for the first time, Jamal could feel the power of his voice, the weight of standing up for what was right. Even when the odds seemed stacked against him, he looked up to find the waitress, who was now standing by the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was still pale, but the fearful tension in her posture had eased. She glanced at Jamal, a small, grateful smile crossing her lips. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. You saved me from something I couldn't have stopped." Jamal nodded, not knowing what to say. The officer had come in with his badge, his authority, and his arrogance. But he was gone now, and Jamal had stood up, not just for the waitress, but for every moment he'd ever witnessed of unfairness and injustice. And for once, it felt like he had won. The door jangled again, and the FBI director walked back into the diner, this time with a calmer, more measured presence. He nodded at Jamal as he approached, his face serious but appreciative. "You did the right thing, Jamal," the director said. "We've already filed a formal complaint against Officer Daniels. His behavior is being reviewed, and the department will take appropriate action. No one gets to treat people like that, not on the job, not anywhere." Jamal didn't know whether to feel relieved or proud. The officer wouldn't get away with his actions, but the realization that it took a power move, someone with connections, to make a difference stung a little. It made him realize how much work still needed to be done, how much farther the fight for fairness had to go. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Jamal asked, his voice a little quieter now, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I do," the director replied, looking at Jamal with a solemn intensity. "But not just because of this one incident. It's the bigger picture that needs to change. It's the everyday acts of racism that go unnoticed until someone calls it out. You've done that. You've made people see what's been happening in plain sight." Jamal looked down at his phone. He could feel the weight of the moment he'd witnessed it all. The power of one person speaking out, the ripple effect it created. And he knew that even if the officer had walked away today, the message had been sent. Things were different now. The director paused for a moment, his voice quieter. "The real battle is bigger than just one man's mistake, though. It's the system. It's how these things get swept under the rug, year after year. People like Officer Daniels believe they're untouchable, until they're not." Jamal thought about that, the words lingering in the air. The system didn't just fail him, it failed his mom, his friends, his community. It failed the people who couldn't afford to stand up for themselves. But it also gave him something new to fight for, change. He left the diner later that night. Jamal felt a quiet strength in his chest, a resolve that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about standing up to one officer. It was about making sure that next time, when someone else was wronged, they had the courage to speak up too. Because change didn't happen in silence. Jamal's mom, when she found out about the incident, was proud of her son for doing what was right, even when it felt terrifying. But she also knew the deeper truth: for real change to happen, it would take more than just one act of bravery. It would take a movement, a wave of people who refused to accept the status quo, who refused to stand by and watch. Days later, the news broke. The story of the racist officer and the teenager who stood up to him spread quickly. The headline read, "Teen confronts racist cop, takes stand for justice in diner, FBI steps in." Jamal watched as the video went viral, his phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. People were praising his courage, his willingness to stand up, even when it seemed like the world might break him. The video, his voice on record, became a symbol of something bigger. People started sharing their own stories of injustice, of unfair treatment, and how they were learning to speak up. The message was clear: no one could stay silent anymore. The fight for equality wasn't over, but it had gained momentum. And in that moment, Jamal knew that he had done more than just confront one officer. He had started a conversation. And conversations, when they're loud enough, lead to change.